From the second book of Kings, chapter 6, verses 17 through 23, Old Testament. Therein you'll find recorded the following. And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike this army with blindness." So he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Elisha told them, "This is not the road and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for." And he led them to Samaria. After they entered the city, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see." Then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" "Do not kill them," he answered. "Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their master." So he prepared a great feast for them, and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. And from our lesson today from the New Testament, from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. Over the last month, I have been contemplating going to see my eye doctor for a new prescription, because it seems that the older I get, the rate at which my eyesight deteriorates has been astonishing. I now have to sleep with my glasses next to me, because when a text from the hospital comes at night, I can no longer accurately retrieve the number unaided. What was once crystal clear is now but a blur, and what was once crisp is now distorted. And so it is no wonder that I was fixated on this portion of Paul's letter, which describes the value of proper sight. And not only that, but it speaks to the proper perception of what we see, and explores the paradox of looking at what cannot be seen. Because we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. I was obsessed this week with this notion of sight. So I wonder, beloved, whether we can explore for just a few moments a question or introspection. What are you looking at? What are you looking at? The gift of sight is one of the greatest gifts we humans possess. To look through those little windows we call eyes and behold the beauty, grandeur, and majesty of all that is God's creation, is one of life's greatest experiences. Of the five senses, sight is the most essential for the gathering of data and information about our world. Indeed, we learn through observation. When the Bible speaks of sight, however, it is never something limited to mere retinal activity. We know from God's Word that it is possible to have 20/20 vision and still not be truly sighted. Conversely, it is possible to be legally blind and yet be fully sighted. Dr. Ralph Sockman made a profound observation to a former generation. Dr. Sockman said that humans have the capacity for 3 levels of sight. First, there is physical sight or retinal activity. This level of sight can be evaluated by an optometrist through the use of an eye chart and other instruments. Secondly, there is mental sight. For example, your accountant seeks to unravel the intricacies and complexities of some new tax law. Finally, after much discussion, you begin to comprehend what the accountant is presenting to you, and you say, "Oh, I see." This form of sight is different from retinal activity because it deals with intellectual comprehension as opposed to physical observation. Thirdly, there is what Sockman calls spiritual sight. Spiritual sight. This form of sight is the ability to see the providence of God in the midst of life's trials, traumas, tribulations, and turbulence. A person with spiritual sight can weather a series of bad breaks with radiant optimism because through the eyes of faith, that person sees and has seen God working. Those prophets, priests, artists, seers, and visionaries who have aided in the moral and spiritual development of our world possess spiritual sight. And our enslaved foreparents possessed this form of sight in great quantity, engulfed in a world of slavery and oppression and stripped of their culture and human dignity. Our enslaved foreparents held on to a faith that saw God's presence even in the midst of their pain. Those songs like "I Got a Robe, You Got a Robe, All God's Children Got a Robe" reflected the enslaved's ability to see beyond the auction blocks, beyond the cotton fields and their subhuman status, to see their own self-worth and God's providential care. Of the 3 forms of sight, physical, mental, and spiritual, I believe the latter, spiritual, is the quintessential form. It is the quest for spiritual sight that is the focus of our text for today from 2 Corinthians and from our connecting text from 2 Kings, which I read to you at the beginning. As I delved into this notion further and deeper, I was led to the connecting text in 2 Kings, which helped to shed some light on this matter. The backstory is the king of Syria had been waging war against Israel. But he had been unsuccessful because at every turn, Israel was able to anticipate his every move. All of his carefully thought out battle plans were met with utter defeat. Whenever the king of Syria tried to ensnare the king of Israel in a trap, the king of Israel was always able to avoid it. And this happened with such regularity that the king of Syria became suspicious, drawing the conclusion that a traitor within his ranks was supplying the enemy with battle plans and strategies. And in a summit meeting with his generals, the king of Syria shared his suspicions and asked, "What man do I have who is for the king of Israel? Who is the the traitor in our midst?" One of the officers answered, "O king, your diagnosis is incorrect. It's not some man in your army who is making trouble for you. Instead, there's a man on the other side with whom God communicates. Therefore, all of the secrets whispered in the privacy of your bedchamber are told to this one man." The king asked, "Where is this one man? If one man is the hindrance, then this one man shall be removed." So thereafter the king of Syria gathered a great army about him and sent them forth under the cover of night to seize the lone prophet Elisha, who was residing in Dothan. And what a tribute the king of Syria unconsciously paid to this lone prophet of God. Imagine sending a great army equipped with all the accoutrements of war to startle, terrify, and capture the plain, simple prophet of God, Elisha. Beloved, institutions of oppression are always threatened by those to whom God has given spiritual insight. Therefore, prophets should not be alarmed when they are the victims of harassment, smear campaigns, tactics of terror, and intimidation. Jesus had his Caiaphas. Paul had his Nero. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had his Hitler. Martin Luther King Jr. had his J. Edgar Hoover. And Colin Kaepernick had his Donald Trump. And each of these persecutors joined the king of Syria and other oppressors throughout the centuries in sharing the same folly, that is, in believing that through implements of war, papal encyclicals, decrees from councils, government legislation, executive orders, incarceration, physical torture, Twitter rants, and death, they can thwart God's will. The United Negro College Fund has used a line in the past from Maya Angelou's poetry that captures the full essence of the oppressor's folly. Maya Angelou says, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise." The king of Syria, along with his men, arrived at Dothan at night. The city was on a hill, imagine with me, surrounded by a wide plain, with the men and the horses and the chariots surrounding the city. There was, humanly speaking, absolutely no possibility of escape. The next morning, when the servant of the prophet arose and went outside, he was seized with fear. All around him, he saw ranks upon ranks of Syrian soldiers. Based on what he saw with his physical eyes, he concluded that there was absolutely no chance of escape. He and his master Elijah were doomed to be captured. And so in fear, the servant hurried back to tell the prophet that all was lost, that everything was hopeless, and that capture was imminent. When Elisha heard of the predicament, he fell on his knees and began to pray. And beloved, we should not be surprised that the prophet prayed. Whenever a person is beset with problems and burdens and deliverance seems impossible, it is a normal response to pray. No, we are not surprised that the prophet prayed, but we are surprised by the content of the prophet's prayer. He didn't pray sweet hour of prayer. He didn't pray, "I need thee every hour." He didn't pray, "Come here, Lord, come here, come by here." He didn't pray, "Father, I stretch my hands to thee, no other help I know." Instead, the prophet prayed, "Lord, open his eyes that he might see." Elisha's prayer was a prayer of intercession for his servant. Though the prayer suggests that the servant was blind, his blindness was not physical. The servant could see the horses and the soldiers and their instruments of destruction. However, this was the limit of his sight. He was devoid of spiritual sight, which left him blind to the presence of another army. Beloved, if all we see is the physical, we are not truly equipped for life. Because the physical represents only a small fraction of what really exists. The marvel of science is not that scientists invent anything, but rather that they see and discover what always existed, but for some reason was unseen. Leonardo da Vinci saw flight in the 15th and 16th centuries, a few hundred years before the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk. Thomas Edison did not invent electricity. He simply saw what was already there. George Washington Carver did not place medicine in the peanut, but through spiritual sight, saw what was already there. It is essential that the artist be able to see the unseen. The story about Michelangelo describes him as approaching a crude, unfinished piece of marble and saying, "Give me my hammer and chisel as I release the angel imprisoned in the marble." Stevie Wonder was once asked if there was anything worse than being blind. And he said, yes, having eyes and not being able to see. Though most of us are able to see, our sight is one-dimensional. We only see the seen. We cannot see the unseen. We only see problems and miss the solutions. We only see burdens and miss the blessings. We only see the faults of our friends and miss their strengths. We only see the victimization and not the victory. We only see racism and not resilience and resolve to overcome. We only see the armies that are against us and not the God who is with us. And here's one other thing I discovered. Some of us, in fact, are guilty of inventing troubles that do not exist. This form of paranoia is expressed in such remarks as, everybody's talking about me. Nobody likes me. Nobody understands me. And many of us have a trouble factory in our house. When troubles do not come naturally, we go to our trouble factory and create artificial ones. Dr. Kevin Cosby told the story of a lady who once came to his church distressed. Her neighbors were running a crack house right next door to where she lived. And she proceeded to tell him that her neighbors would not leave her alone and she had no one to help her. He stated that lawyers in the church could be of assistance, but she said, I can't afford one. He invited her to church and she said, I have no ride. He told her the church van would pick her up and she said, I don't have any good clothes. He told her that she could come as she was and she said, I would not feel comfortable in pants. All she could see was the problem. She could not see the solution. Oh, does she remind you of anyone you know? Think for a moment about this piece of advice. If you want to get an assessment of a piece of property, don't ask a buzzard to do the survey. buzzard would look down upon the landscape where there are carpets of green grass and where flowers spill out winsome fragrances. But the buzzard will never see the flowers. Instead, the buzzard will zero in on a decayed piece of flesh hidden away in the weeds, because this is all the buzzard has the capacity to see. Jesus said that the pure in heart would see God. But sometimes we lose the capacity to see because of our own stubborn ways and our own proclivity towards sin. And you know, there are a lot of Christian buzzards. They don't see their opportunities for growth, usefulness, and joy. Instead, they focus on the negative and dwell on the disastrous. There are, I discovered, female buzzards who gather together at buzzard shops, commonly known as beauty shops, saying that they are no good men. One buzzard starts talking with other buzzards, joining in to reinforce each other's buzzardness. There are male buzzards who see only racism and oppression and victimization. Yes, racism and oppression are real. Yes, the scapegoating of the black male and the criminalization of his image are real, but that is not all there is to see. Ask Booker T. Washington. He saw racism, but that's not all he saw. He saw Tuskegee. Ask Madam C.J. Walker. She saw racism, but that's not all that she saw. Before James Brown said it in the 1960s, she saw that black is beautiful. Ask Mary McLeod Bethune. She saw illiteracy, but that's not all she saw. She saw illiteracy, but she also saw discarded chairs and desks that could be transformed into instruments of learning and enlightenment. Ask Barry Gordy. He saw many closed doors, but that's not all he saw. He saw an America dancing to Marvin Gaye and the Temptations and the Four Tops and the Supremes. How is this kind of sight developed? The text in 2 Kings helped me out. The text in 2 Kings chapter 6 says that Elisha prayed that his servant's eyes might be opened. You know, you will discover that prayer is a real eye-opener. Many of us doubt the efficacy of prayer because we think of it as a magic lamp we rub to make genies come out and do our bidding. And when the genies don't come out, we begin to doubt the utility of prayer. However, beloved, the real value of prayer is that it enlarges our sympathies, quiets our mind, sweetens our dispositions, widens our perspectives, soothes our spirit, purifies our thoughts, and calms our anxieties. Indeed, prayer opens our eyes. When the servant's eyes were opened, he saw that encompassed around the Syrian army was the army of the Lord, with horses and chariots of fire. God was always there, but the servant had not been aware of it. God is not an absentee God, for God is always here. God comes in unexpected ways and in unexpected times, but God is always present. God comes through the tired feet of a Rosa Parks. God comes through the imprisonment of a Nelson Mandela. God comes comes through the uprising of a Nat Turner. God comes through the nationalism of a Malcolm X. God comes through the political activism of Jesse Jackson and the genuflection of a Colin Kaepernick. Paul Tillich says that God is present in the spirit that makes us restless with injustice and evil in the world. Prayer is a real eye-opener. It's a real eye-opener because it opens our eyes to the reality of God's presence in all, not just some, but in all of life's circumstances. Living life with an awareness of God's presence and providential care enables us to overcome the Syrian threats in our lives. When we see God, it is impossible to see hopelessness and despair and gloom and defeat. When we see God, enemies become less significant. When we see God, we see a way in the midst of steep mountains and low valleys. When we see God, we have victory in the midst of ill wishers and backbiters and hole diggers and joy stealers and dream busters and depression makers. It is not that these people don't exist, but we know that God is greater than any who are against us. God's grace is greater than our sins. God's presence is greater than our fears. God's healing is greater than our sicknesses. And God's resurrection is greater than our death. Oh, that's why the psalmist declares in Psalm 27, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked, even mine enemies, and my foes came upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and they fell. Though an army, a host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this I will be confident. So I wonder today, beloved, as you leave this place, what are you looking at? What are you looking at? Amen.